Captain Sarah had always been told she wasn't fighter pilot material. At 28, she had spent the last 6 years flying cargo runs and passenger transports across some of the most dangerous airspace in the conflict zone. Her commanding officers consistently praised her steady hands and calm demeanor, but when she applied for fighter training 3 times, the response was always the same polite rejection. Too cautious, they said. Transport pilots think differently than fighter jocks. Different mentality entirely. Sarah had learned to live with the disappointment, but it never stopped burning inside her chest. Every morning when she climbed into the cockpit of her massive C-130 Hercules transport plane, she imagined herself strapped into the sleek seat of an F-16 Fighting Falcon instead. She knew the specs of every fighter aircraft by heart, studied combat maneuvers in her spare time, and practiced aerial tactics on her flight simulator until her eyes burned from staring at the screen. The morning of September 15th started like any other routine supply mission. Sarah was scheduled to transport medical supplies and replacement parts to Forward Operating Base Delta, a remote outpost situated dangerously close to enemy territory. The base had been under intermittent attack for weeks, and supply runs had become increasingly risky. 3 transport planes had been lost in the past month, along with their crews. Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking every system twice. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant James, was a nervous young man fresh out of flight school who had only been assigned to transport duty for 2 months. He kept glancing at the intelligence briefings scattered across their planning table, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the route markers. "Relax," Sarah said, her voice steady and reassuring. "We've flown this route dozens of times. The key is staying alert and following protocol exactly." The weather conditions were less than ideal. Thick cloud cover hung low across the mountain ranges they would need to traverse, and intelligence reports indicated increased enemy fighter activity in the region. Command had considered postponing the mission, but the medical supplies on board were desperately needed at the forward base. 2 wounded soldiers were in critical condition and required immediate surgical intervention that couldn't wait another day. As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah noticed unusual activity around the fighter squadron hangar. Several F-16s were being prepped for what appeared to be an emergency scramble. Maintenance crews worked frantically to load missiles and check systems. Something was happening that hadn't been included in their morning briefing. The control tower cleared them for takeoff at exactly 0900 hours. Sarah pushed the throttles forward, feeling the familiar surge of power as the 4 turboprop engines wound up to full strength. The heavily loaded Hercules required nearly the entire length of the runway before lifting off, climbing slowly into the overcast sky. 20 minutes into the flight, their radio crackled with an urgent transmission from command. "Transport 74, be advised we have multiple bogies inbound to your sector. Recommend immediate course deviation to alternate route Bravo." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and banked left toward the alternate route, which would add 30 minutes to their flight time, but kept them well clear of the reported enemy activity. Consulted his charts nervously, updating their navigation computer with the new waypoints. "What do you think is really going on out there?" asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Probably just routine patrol activity that got," Sarah replied, though something in her gut told her otherwise. She had developed a sixth sense about dangerous situations during her years of flying in contested airspace. The way command had worded their warning suggested something more serious than a routine encounter. As they climbed through 8,000 feet, the cloud cover began to thin, revealing patches of mountainous terrain below. Sarah kept one eye on their radar display, watching for any signs of aerial traffic. The screen remained clear except for their own blip moving steadily across the green background. 45 minutes into the flight, they received another transmission, this one crackling with static and urgency. All aircraft, this is Raptor Lead. We have multiple enemy fighters crossing the northern border. Heavy resistance encountered, requesting immediate backup." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Raptor Lead was the call sign for the elite fighter squadron based at their home airfield. If they were calling for backup, the situation was serious indeed. She switched to the emergency frequency and listened as fragmented reports came through from various units engaged in aerial combat. The picture that emerged was troubling. A large formation of enemy fighters had crossed the border and was systematically attacking military installations and supply routes. The defending fighters were outnumbered and taking heavy losses. Several bases had gone dark completely, their communication systems either jammed or destroyed. "Should we abort the mission?" asked, his face pale as he monitored the radio traffic. Sarah considered their options carefully. Forward operating Base Delta was still several hours away, and the route would take them directly through what was rapidly becoming an active combat zone. Protocol dictated that transport aircraft should avoid combat areas at all costs, but those wounded soldiers needed the medical supplies they carried, and every minute counted. "We continue the mission," she decided, "but we stay low and use the terrain to mask our approach, and we monitor every frequency for updates." They descended to just above the mountain peaks, using the rugged terrain to hide their radar signature. Sarah's hands moved instinctively across the controls, making constant small adjustments to keep them in the valleys and ravines that would provide the best concealment. This kind of low-level flying required absolute precision and total concentration. Continued monitoring the radio, relaying updates as they came in. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fighters had established air superiority over large sections of the border region. Several transport planes attempting supply runs had been shot down, and search and rescue operations were being hampered by ongoing combat. As they approached a narrow mountain pass that marked the halfway point to their destination, Sarah spotted something that made her blood run cold. High above them, barely visible against the cloud cover, she could see the contrails of multiple aircraft engaged in aerial combat. The white streaks crisscrossed the sky like deadly artwork, marking the paths of missiles and the desperate maneuvers of pilots fighting for their lives. "Contact 12 o'clock high," she reported to, who immediately began scanning the sky with binoculars. "I count at least 6 aircraft," he said, his voice tense. "Looks like 2 of ours and 4 enemies. Our guys are outnumbered." Sarah watched the aerial battle unfold above them, feeling helpless and frustrated. Every instinct screamed at her to climb and join the fight, but her massive transport plane was no match for enemy fighters. She was armed with nothing but flare dispensers and chaff to confuse incoming missiles. One of the friendly fighters suddenly broke away from the engagement, trailing black smoke from its engine. Sarah could see the pilot was trying to reach friendly territory before attempting an ejection, but the aircraft was losing altitude rapidly. 2 enemy fighters pursued relentlessly, closing in for the kill. "Transport 74, this is Falcon 2, came a desperate radio call. "I'm hit bad and losing hydraulics. Enemy fighters in pursuit, requesting any assistance possible." Sarah felt something snap inside her chest. She had spent years being told she wasn't fighter pilot material, that she didn't have the right mentality for aerial combat. But watching a fellow pilot about to die while enemy fighters roamed freely through their airspace triggered something primal and fierce within her. "Take the controls," she ordered, her voice suddenly hard and determined. "What are you planning?" he asked, though he immediately grasped the pilot's yoke. "Something they definitely didn't teach in transport pilot school," Sarah replied, reaching for the weapons systems panel that most transport crews never touched. The C-130 Hercules was officially classified as an unarmed transport aircraft, but Sarah knew that designation wasn't entirely accurate. Like many military transports operating in combat zones, their aircraft had been retrofitted with defensive systems that could be used offensively under the right circumstances. Most pilots never bothered to learn how to operate them properly. Sarah wasn't most pilots. During her off-duty hours over the past several years, she had quietly studied every manual and technical specification she could find about their aircraft's defensive capabilities. She had even convinced a sympathetic weapons technician to give her informal training on the systems during maintenance periods. The Hercules carried 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles mounted on external pylons, officially intended for self-defense against enemy fighters. Most transport pilots considered them little more than psychological comfort, since engaging enemy fighters in a lumbering cargo plane was considered suicidal. Sarah rapidly powered up the weapons systems, her fingers dancing across controls that most transport pilots had never touched in actual operation. The targeting radar came online with a low hum, and she began scanning for the enemy fighters pursuing Falcon 2. "Sarah, what are you doing?" asked, his voice filled with alarm. "Saving a pilot's life," she replied grimly, acquiring a lock on the nearest enemy fighter. The mathematics of aerial combat flashed through her mind with crystalline clarity. The enemy fighters were focused entirely on their pursuit of the damaged friendly aircraft, making them vulnerable to attack from an unexpected direction. Their position relative to the mountains would limit their maneuvering options once they realized they were under attack. Sarah rolled the massive transport plane into a steep diving turn that would have terrified any sane pilot. The aircraft groaned under stresses it was never designed to handle, but she had calculated the structural limits carefully. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the enemy pilots realized what was happening. "Missile away," she announced calmly, watching the Sidewinders streak away from their aircraft toward the leading enemy fighter. The enemy pilot never saw it coming. The missile struck his aircraft just behind the cockpit, and the fighter disintegrated in a brilliant fireball. His wingman broke off pursuit of Falcon 2 and began searching frantically for the source of the attack. "Transport 74, this is Falcon 2, came an amazed radio call. "Did you just splash an enemy fighter?" "Confirmed," Sarah replied, already maneuvering for a shot at the second enemy aircraft. "Suggest you use the distraction to reach friendly territory." The second enemy pilot had spotted them now and was turning to engage. Sarah found herself facing off against a highly trained fighter pilot in an aircraft specifically designed for aerial combat. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was suicide, but something deeper and more fundamental had taken control. She pulled the Hercules into another impossible maneuver, using the aircraft's surprising agility at low altitude to avoid the enemy pilot's first missile. The heat-seeking weapon passed just beneath their starboard wing and detonated harmlessly against a mountain peak. Was gripping his seat so tightly his knuckles had turned white, but he maintained control of the basic flight systems while Sarah focused on combat maneuvering. "How is this possible?" he gasped as they rolled inverted to avoid cannon fire. "Transport pilots think differently," Sarah said, echoing the words that had been used to reject her fighter applications. "We understand aircraft systems better than anyone." She was using every advantage their unusual aircraft provided. The Hercules could fly slower than any fighter without stalling, allowing her to force overshoots when enemy pilots misjudged their attack runs. Its multiple engines provided redundancy that kept them flying even when taking damage. Most importantly, its size and unconventional appearance kept enemy pilots off balance and uncertain about her capabilities. The second enemy fighter came around for another attack, but this time Sarah was ready. She had positioned them perfectly, using a mountain peak to mask their approach until the last possible moment. As the enemy aircraft committed to its attack run, she fired their second Sidewinder missile. The enemy pilot tried desperately to evade, but he was too close and moving too fast. The missile struck his aircraft's engine intake, and Sarah watched the fighter spin out of control before impacting the mountainside in a spectacular explosion. "2 confirmed kills," she reported matter-of-factly, as if shooting down enemy fighters was routine transport pilot business. The radio exploded with chatter as word of their engagement spread throughout the combat zone. Transport pilots weren't supposed to engage enemy fighters, let alone shoot them down. Command was demanding immediate explanations, while other pilots struggled to understand what had just happened. "Falcon 2 has reached friendly territory," came a grateful radio call. "Transport 74, I owe you a case of beer. That was the most incredible flying I've ever seen." But their celebration was premature. Sarah's radar screen lit up with new contacts approaching from the north. A full squadron of enemy fighters was converging on their position, apparently determined to eliminate the transport plane that had just embarrassed their air force. "We've got company incoming," she announced grimly. 12 bogies closing fast. Stared at the radar display in horror. "We can't fight 12 fighters." Sarah's jaw set in a hard line as she counted their remaining weapons. 2 Sidewinder missiles, limited cannon ammunition, and a transport plane that was never designed for sustained aerial combat. The 12 enemy fighters approached in a classic attack formation, spread across a 3-mile front at different altitudes. Sarah quickly analyzed their positioning and realized they were treating her transport plane like a standard cargo target, expecting an easy kill. That tactical assumption would be their first mistake. "I need you to handle communications and systems monitoring," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the impossible odds they faced. Keep command updated on our status and watch for any system failures. She dove toward the deck, using the mountainous terrain to break up the enemy formation's attack vectors. The Hercules skimmed just above the treetops, its massive frame casting shadows across the valleys below. At this altitude, the enemy fighters would have difficulty coordinating their attacks without risking collision with the mountains or each other. The lead enemy fighter dove to intercept them, clearly confident that a single attack run would be sufficient to destroy a slow transport plane. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then pulled the Hercules into a sharp climbing turn that should have been impossible for an aircraft of its size and weight. The enemy pilot overshot, finding himself suddenly below and ahead of his intended target. Sarah immediately rolled inverted and fired her third Sidewinder missile straight down at the surprised fighter. The weapon struck the aircraft's fuselage directly behind the cockpit, and the enemy plane disintegrated in a ball of flame and debris. Pieces of wreckage scattered across the mountainside below. 3 down, 9 to go, she announced calmly, already scanning for the next target. The remaining enemy pilots suddenly realized they weren't dealing with a helpless transport crew. Radio chatter in their language filled the airwaves as they attempted to reorganize their attack. Sarah couldn't understand their words, but the tone of confusion and growing frustration was unmistakable. 2 fighters approached from opposite directions, attempting to trap the Hercules in a crossfire. Sarah used the transport's surprising low-speed handling characteristics to her advantage, chopping the throttles and deploying flaps to suddenly reduce their airspeed. Both enemy fighters overshot, unable to slow down quickly enough to maintain their attack runs. As the fighters streaked past on either side, Sarah rolled left and fired her final Sidewinder at the nearest target. The missile tracked perfectly, striking the enemy aircraft's engine and sending it spiraling into the mountainside. Simultaneously, she brought the Hercules' defensive cannon to bear on the second fighter. The twin-mounted 20mm cannons weren't designed for air-to-air combat, but Sarah had studied their ballistics extensively during her off-duty hours. She led the target carefully, accounting for the complex relative motion between their aircraft. A sustained burst caught the enemy fighter's wing root, severing hydraulic lines and control cables. The damaged aircraft attempted to turn away, but its pilot had lost primary flight controls. Sarah watched the fighter enter an unrecoverable spin before impacting a distant ridge in a spectacular fireball. 5 confirmed kills, reported over the radio, his voice filled with amazement and terror in equal measure. Command responded immediately with disbelief and demands for clarification. Transport pilots didn't shoot down enemy fighters, especially not in such numbers. Sarah ignored the radio chatter, focusing entirely on the 7 remaining enemy aircraft that were regrouping for a coordinated assault. The enemy pilots had abandoned their overconfident approach and were now treating her as a serious threat. They formed up in pairs, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm her defensive capabilities. It was a textbook fighter tactics maneuver that should have been devastating against any single aircraft. Sarah recognized the attack pattern from her countless hours studying aerial combat manuals. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the coordinated assault began, and her transport plane was now armed with nothing but cannon ammunition and defensive countermeasures. "Hold on tight," she warned, pulling the Hercules into a steep climbing spiral that used the surrounding mountain peaks as natural obstacles. The first pair of fighters dove toward them from high altitude, attempting to bracket their escape route. Sarah waited until they committed to their attack angle, then suddenly rolled the massive transport plane inverted and dove straight toward the mountainside below. The maneuver was so unexpected and aggressive that both enemy pilots hesitated, uncertain whether she was attempting an attack run or had simply lost control. That moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. She rolled upright just above the treetops and pulled into a sharp climbing turn that brought her cannon to bear on the lower fighter. A precise burst shattered the enemy aircraft's canopy and destroyed its flight controls. The pilot ejected successfully, but his aircraft crashed into the valley below. The second fighter in the pair tried to follow her climb, but the pilot misjudged the Hercules' turning radius. Sarah continued her spiral until she was above and behind the enemy aircraft, then dove on him like a hawk attacking prey. Her cannon fire struck the fighter's engine compartment, and the aircraft exploded in a brilliant orange fireball. 7 down, 5 remaining, she reported, already searching for the next targets. The surviving enemy pilots were becoming desperate and increasingly reckless. Two fighters approached head-on, attempting to force her into a collision course while a third maneuvered to attack from below. It was a dangerous gambit that relied on her unwillingness to risk destruction. Sarah proved them wrong by advancing throttles to maximum power and charging directly toward the head-on attackers. The massive transport plane accelerated slowly but inexorably, its four turboprop engines producing a combined 11,000 horsepower. The enemy pilots expected her to break away at the last moment, but she held course until collision seemed inevitable. At the final instant, she pulled the Hercules into a climb so steep it bordered on the impossible. The enemy fighters passed directly beneath her, one of them clipping the transport's landing gear with its vertical stabilizer. Both enemy aircraft suffered damage from the contact, but Sarah's aircraft remained controllable. The fighter below opened fire as they climbed, cannon shells stitching across the Hercules' fuselage. Several rounds penetrated the cargo compartment, but the transport's robust construction absorbed the damage. Sarah rolled over the top of her climb and dove back toward the enemy formation, her cannon tracking the nearest target. Her burst caught the attacking fighter squarely in the cockpit area. The enemy aircraft rolled inverted and plunged toward the ground, its pilot either dead or unconscious. Sarah counted 8 confirmed kills as the wreckage impacted the mountainside. The remaining 4 fighters were now circling warily, their pilots clearly shaken by their squadron's devastating losses. Radio chatter indicated they were requesting additional reinforcements and possibly considering withdrawal from the engagement. Sarah refused to give them the opportunity to regroup. She drove straight into their formation, using the Hercules' size and unexpected aggressiveness to break up their coordination. Enemy pilots scattered in all directions, each seeking to avoid collision with the seemingly unstoppable transport plane. One fighter pulled into a steep climb directly ahead of her aircraft. Sarah followed relentlessly, her cannon firing continuously as she pursued the enemy pilot toward the cloud ceiling. The fighter pilot was skilled and experienced, but he had never faced an opponent who combined transport aircraft endurance with fighter-pilot aggression. The chase continued for nearly 3 minutes, with both aircraft climbing steadily through 8,000 feet. The enemy pilot attempted every evasive maneuver in his repertoire, but Sarah anticipated each move and maintained her pursuit. Finally, a sustained cannon burst struck the fighter's fuel system, and the aircraft exploded in a massive fireball that illuminated the surrounding clouds. 9 confirmed kills, announced, his voice hoarse from calling out targets and threats. The 3 surviving enemy fighters had formed a defensive circle, apparently hopping to present too many targets for her to engage safely. It was a sound, tactical decision that might have worked against a conventional opponent. Sarah approached the circling formation from below, using the angle of attack that would force them to break their defensive pattern. As the nearest fighter turned to engage her, she suddenly chopped power and deployed full flaps, causing her aircraft to decelerate rapidly. The enemy pilot overshot and found himself directly ahead of her cannon. A 2-second burst was sufficient to destroy the fighter's tail section. The aircraft pitched nose down and spiraled into the mountainside, leaving only 2 enemy fighters remaining from the original 12-plane formation. The surviving pilots were now operating purely on survival instinct. They broke formation and attempted to flee toward friendly territory, abandoning any pretense of completing their mission. Sarah pursued the nearest aircraft, her transport plane gradually closing the distance despite its lower maximum speed. The chase continued across 3 mountain ranges, with the enemy fighter pilot pushing his aircraft to maximum performance in a desperate attempt to escape. Sarah maintained relentless pressure, firing short bursts whenever the range closed sufficiently. Several hits damaged the fighter's engine, reducing its speed and sealing its fate. The final cannon burst struck the enemy aircraft's wing root, severing the main spar and causing the wing to fold upward. The fighter entered an uncontrolled tumble and impacted the ground seconds later. Sarah had achieved her 10th confirmed kill in less than 24 minutes of aerial combat. The last surviving enemy fighter had used the distraction to escape toward the border, but Sarah was content to let him go. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the tactical situation had changed dramatically. The immediate threat to their supply mission had been eliminated. Transport 74, this is command, came an urgent radio transmission. Confirm your status and location immediately. Command, Transport 74, Sarah replied calmly. Mission continuing as planned. We have eliminated a squadron of enemy fighters that were threatening our route to forward operating base Delta. The radio fell silent for nearly 30 seconds before command responded. Transport 74, confirm you said eliminated enemy fighters. How many aircraft were involved? 11 confirmed kills, 1 probable, Sarah reported matter-of-factly. Enemy fighters are no longer a threat to supply operations in this sector. Stared at her in amazement as they resumed course toward their original destination. The cargo compartment behind them was riddled with bullet holes. Several instruments had been damaged by enemy fire, and their fuel consumption was higher than normal due to combat maneuvering. But the aircraft was still airworthy, and their vital medical cargo remained secure. How did you learn to fly like that? Asked quietly. Sarah smiled grimly as she adjusted their course toward forward operating base Delta. I spent 6 years being told I wasn't fighter pilot material. Turns out they were wrong about what transport pilots are capable of. The radio crackled with excited chatter as word of their engagement spread throughout the combat zone. Fighter pilots were asking for confirmation of the impossible kill count. Transport crews were requesting tactical advice. Command was demanding detailed after-action reports. But Sarah's focus remained entirely on completing their mission. 2 wounded soldiers were waiting for the medical supplies in their cargo hold, and every minute counted. She increased power and adjusted their approach to make up for time lost during the aerial battle. As forward operating base Delta appeared on the horizon, Sarah realized her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a transport pilot who dreamed of flying fighters. She had proven that the distinction between transport and fighter pilots existed only in the minds of people who lacked imagination. The landing at forward operating base Delta was routine despite the combat damage their aircraft had sustained. Medical personnel rushed to unload the critical supplies, while maintenance crews examined the bullet holes and battle damage. News of their aerial victories had preceded their arrival, and Sarah found herself surrounded by amazed personnel who wanted to hear details of the engagement. But there was no time for celebration. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were preparing a major offensive that would require immediate evacuation of wounded personnel and essential equipment. Sarah would need to prepare for the return flight through airspace that remained contested and dangerous. Against overwhelm, the medical personnel at forward operating base Delta worked with desperate efficiency to load wounded soldiers onto Sarah's aircraft. The 2 critical patients she had risked everything to save were already in surgery, their lives hanging by threads that her aerial battle had helped preserve. Now 12 more wounded personnel needed immediate evacuation to the main medical facility, and intelligence reports suggested enemy forces were advancing rapidly toward the base. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, approached Sarah as she supervised the loading operations. His weathered face showed a mixture of gratitude and amazement that she had become accustomed to seeing since news of her aerial victories spread. Captain, I've been flying for 23 years, and I've never heard of anything like what you accomplished today, he said quietly. Command is requesting an immediate debrief when you return to base. Sarah nodded while continuing her inspection of the aircraft's battle damage. Several cannon rounds had penetrated the cargo compartment, and hydraulic fluid stained the tarmac beneath the starboard wing. The aircraft remained airworthy, but its performance would be degraded during the return flight. Sir, what's the current tactical situation? She asked. Are we expecting more enemy air activity? Colonel Martinez consulted his tactical display, showing a map covered with red symbols indicating enemy positions. Intelligence suggests they're bringing up additional fighter squadrons to replace the losses you inflicted. They're also advancing ground forces to cut off our supply routes. The implications were clear. Sarah's aerial victory had disrupted enemy operations, but it had also made her aircraft a high-priority target. Every enemy pilot in the region would be looking for revenge against the transport crew that had humiliated their air force. Finished his pre-flight inspection and approached with a clipboard full of discrepancy reports. We've got hydraulic leaks, damaged navigation equipment, and holes in 3 fuel tanks, he reported. The auxiliary pump is keeping fuel pressure stable, but we'll need to monitor consumption carefully. Sarah reviewed the damage assessment while calculating their options. The wounded soldiers needed immediate medical attention that the base couldn't provide. Delaying the evacuation flight could cost lives, but attempting to fly through contested airspace in a damaged aircraft presented enormous risks. We launch in 10 minutes, she decided. Plot an alternative route that keeps us over friendly territory as much as possible. The loading continued with military precision. Medical personnel secured stretcher cases in the cargo compartment while ensuring critical life support equipment remained operational during flight. Several walking wounded took seats along the aircraft's sidewalls, their faces showing the strain of recent combat. As Sarah completed her final systems checks, a young sergeant approached nervously. "Ma'am, is it true you shot down 11 enemy fighters today?" 12, Sarah corrected matter-of-factly. "We confirmed one additional kill during post-flight analysis." The sergeant stared at her in amazement. "Ma'am, I'm a fighter pilot, and I've never scored more than 3 kills in a single engagement. How does a transport pilot achieve 12 victories?" Sarah paused in her checklist to consider the question. "Transport pilots understand our aircraft better than anyone else understands theirs. We know every system limitation and capability. That knowledge becomes tactical advantage when applied creatively." She didn't mention the countless hours she had spent studying fighter tactics, weapon systems, and aerial combat maneuvers. The years of frustration and rejected applications had driven her to prepare for opportunities that everyone assumed would never come. The engine started normally despite the battle damage, and Sarah taxied toward the runway while monitoring instrument readings carefully. Hydraulic pressure fluctuated slightly, but remained within acceptable parameters. The wounded soldiers in the cargo compartment were stable and ready for the flight to definitive medical care. Control tower cleared them for immediate takeoff, with instructions to contact regional command once airborne for updated threat assessments. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the familiar surge of power as the Hercules accelerated down the runway. The aircraft felt slightly sluggish due to battle damage and maximum payload, but it lifted off smoothly and began climbing toward their cruising altitude. "Transport 74 airborne at 1520 hours, she reported, proceeding to alternate route Charlie with 12 evacuees aboard. The response came immediately from multiple sources. Regional command confirmed their clearance while providing updated intelligence about enemy air activity. Fighter escort was being prepared, but wouldn't be available for 30 minutes due to ongoing combat operations in other sectors. Monitored navigation systems while calling out course corrections needed to avoid known threats. Their alternate route would add 40 minutes to the flight time, but it kept them over mountainous terrain that provided some protection from radar detection. 15 minutes into the flight, their defensive warning system activated with urgent beeping. Enemy aircraft were approaching from the northeast, still beyond visual range but closing rapidly. Sarah immediately descended toward the mountain valleys, using terrain masking to break enemy radar locks. "Contact bearing 045 multiple aircraft," reported. "Appears to be a full squadron approaching at high speed." Sarah banked left into a narrow valley that provided excellent concealment from above. The damaged hydraulic system made the aircraft more difficult to control, requiring constant inputs to maintain precise flight paths. She flew manually, trusting her instincts more than the partially degraded automated systems. The enemy formation passed overhead without detecting their position. Sarah counted 6 fighters in close formation, obviously searching for the transport that had destroyed their sister squadron earlier. Their flight pattern suggested they were conducting a systematic sweep of all possible escape routes. "They're really serious about finding us," observed quietly. "Can't blame them," Sarah replied. "Losing 12 fighters to a transport plane is embarrassing enough to end careers." They continued through the mountain valleys, staying low enough to avoid radar detection while high enough to clear the peaks safely. The wounded soldiers in the cargo compartment remained stable, though several required constant monitoring of their life support systems. 25 minutes later, their warning system activated again. This time the threat was more serious. 2 fighters had detected their heat signature and were diving to intercept. Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers, but the damaged aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs. "They've found us," she announced calmly. "Secure the cargo and prepare for combat maneuvering." The first enemy fighter dove toward them from high altitude, firing missiles while still at maximum range. Sarah watched the heat-seeking weapons approach on her threat display, calculating intercept angles and timing. At the last possible moment, she deployed flares and chaff while pulling into a steep climbing turn. The defensive measures worked perfectly. Both missiles locked onto the flare signatures and detonated harmlessly behind their aircraft. But the enemy pilot was already lining up for a cannon attack, and Sarah's damaged aircraft couldn't match the maneuverability she had demonstrated earlier. The second fighter approached from a different angle, attempting to trap them in a crossfire. Sarah realized that conventional evasive tactics wouldn't be sufficient against two determined opponents in faster, more agile aircraft. She needed to use unconventional methods that would exploit her enemy's assumptions about transport aircraft capabilities. Instead of attempting to escape, Sarah turned directly toward the nearest enemy fighter and accelerated to maximum speed. The enemy pilot expected her to break away or attempt defensive maneuvers, but she held course as if determined to ram his aircraft. The enemy pilot broke first, pulling into a steep climb to avoid collision. Sarah immediately rolled inverted and dove toward the second fighter, which was approaching from below. Her sudden direction change caught the enemy pilot completely off guard, and he found himself directly in front of her remaining cannon ammunition. Sarah fired a sustained burst that struck the enemy aircraft's engine compartment. The fighter immediately caught fire and began streaming black smoke. The pilot attempted to maintain control, but his aircraft was too badly damaged. He ejected successfully just before the fighter crashed into the mountainside. The first enemy pilot had recovered from his evasive maneuver and was turning to re-engage. Sarah used her altitude advantage to dive away from his attack, but the damaged hydraulics made precise maneuvering increasingly difficult. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel as multiple systems approached failure thresholds. The enemy fighter pursued relentlessly, firing cannon bursts that missed by increasingly narrow margins. Sarah's aircraft was leaving a visible contrail due to damaged fuel systems, making concealment impossible. She needed to end this engagement quickly before catastrophic system failures made the aircraft uncontrollable. "Can you operate the flare dispensers manually?" she asked while pulling into another evasive turn. "Yes, ma'am, what do you need?" "On my command, fire all remaining flares simultaneously. I need maximum thermal confusion for about 10 seconds. Sarah climbed toward a cloud layer while the enemy fighter positioned for what appeared to be a final attack run. The pilot was confident and aggressive, certain that his damaged opponent could no longer escape. That overconfidence would be his tactical error. "Execute flares now," Sarah commanded. Triggered every remaining flare in their defensive system. Dozens of heat sources suddenly appeared around their aircraft, creating a thermal signature that overwhelmed enemy targeting systems. Sarah immediately cut power and deployed full flaps, causing the transport to decelerate rapidly while diving toward the mountainside. The enemy pilot lost visual contact in the flare confusion and fired missiles at false targets. When the thermal interference cleared, Sarah's aircraft had disappeared from his scope. He circled frantically, searching for the transport that seemed to have vanished completely. Sarah had used the terrain masking technique that transport pilots learned for avoiding surface-to-air missiles. By descending rapidly into a narrow valley while reducing heat signature, she had effectively become invisible to enemy sensors. The technique required precise flying and intimate knowledge of aircraft performance characteristics. They remained hidden in the valley system for nearly 15 minutes while the enemy pilot searched overhead. Finally, the fighter departed toward the border, apparently convinced that his target had escaped or crashed. Sarah waited another 10 minutes before resuming course toward home base. The remainder of the flight proceeded without incident, though several aircraft systems continued to degrade. Hydraulic pressure dropped steadily, requiring Sarah to use manual backup controls for most flight operations. Fuel consumption remained higher than normal, but they had sufficient reserves to reach their destination. "Transport 74 requesting priority landing clearance," she transmitted as their base appeared ahead. "We have 12 medical evacuees aboard and multiple aircraft systems failures." Control tower immediately cleared all traffic from their approach path. Emergency vehicles positioned along the runway while medical personnel prepared to receive the wounded soldiers. Sarah configured the aircraft for landing despite degraded control response, touching down smoothly on the main runway. As they taxied toward the medical facility, Sarah could see dozens of personnel gathering to witness their arrival. News of the aerial engagement had spread throughout the base, and everyone wanted to see the transport crew that had achieved the impossible. Medical teams immediately began transferring wounded soldiers to waiting ambulances. Several patients were critical, but all had survived the evacuation flight and would receive the definitive care they needed. Sarah felt deep satisfaction knowing that her decisions had saved lives despite the enormous risks involved. Colonel, the base commander, was waiting as they shut down engines. His expression showed a mixture of pride, amazement, and concern about the precedent Sarah had established. Transport pilots weren't supposed to engage in aerial combat, regardless of the circumstances or outcome. "Captain, I need to see you in my office immediately," he said quietly. "Washington has some very serious questions about today's activities." Sarah nodded while completing her post-flight inspection. She had expected this conversation and was prepared to defend every decision she had made. The success of her mission spoke for itself, but military bureaucracy rarely appreciated unconventional approaches to tactical problems. Gathered their flight documentation while maintenance crews began assessing the extensive battle damage. The aircraft would require weeks of repair work before returning to service. Multiple systems needed complete replacement, and the airframe required structural inspections to ensure flight safety. As Sarah walked toward the command building, she reflected on the day's events. In less than 4 hours, she had proven that the artificial distinctions between transport and fighter pilots existed only in the minds of people who lacked imagination. Combat effectiveness depended on skill, determination, and tactical awareness rather than aircraft designation. But she also understood that her actions would have consequences extending far beyond this single mission. The military establishment would need to reconsider fundamental assumptions about aircrew roles. Colonel's office felt unusually crowded with senior officers from multiple commands gathered around conference tables covered with tactical maps and incident reports. Sarah recognized several faces from previous briefings, but the presence of 2 generals and an admiral suggested this debriefing had escalated far beyond routine operational review. "Captain, please take a seat," Colonel said formally. "We need to understand exactly how today's engagement unfolded and what tactical innovations you employed." Sarah sat quietly while a recording device was activated, and stenographers prepared to document every word. The atmosphere was tense, with some officers showing obvious skepticism about reports of a transport pilot achieving 12 aerial victories against trained fighter pilots. General, the regional air commander, opened his folder and began reading from preliminary reports. "Captain, multiple sources confirm that you engaged and destroyed 12 enemy fighters while flying an unarmed C-130 transport aircraft. Can you explain how this was tactically possible?" "Sir, the aircraft wasn't entirely unarmed," Sarah replied carefully. "Our C-130 carried defensive armament including 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles and twin 20mm cannons. These systems are standard equipment for transports operating in contested airspace. Standard equipment that most transport pilots never learn to use effectively," Admiral Richardson interjected. "Your personnel file indicates you've never attended air-to-air combat training or weapons school. Where did you acquire the tactical knowledge to achieve such results?" Sarah had prepared for this question during the flight back to base. "Sir, I spent considerable off-duty time studying aerial combat manuals, weapons system specifications, and fighter tactics. I also received informal training from weapons technicians during aircraft maintenance periods." The senior officers exchanged glances that clearly indicated surprise and concern. Self-taught combat skills weren't normally encouraged in transport pilots, whose primary mission involved cargo delivery rather than aerial warfare. General consulted his notes before continuing. "Captain, your engagement violated several standard operating procedures regarding transport aircraft in combat situations. Can you explain your decision-making process?" "Sir, I observed friendly fighters under attack by superior numbers of enemy aircraft. Standard doctrine would have required me to avoid the combat area, but that would have allowed enemy pilots to continue attacking our forces unopposed. Sarah paused to organize her thoughts carefully. I determined that unconventional tactics could achieve tactical surprise and eliminate the immediate threat. Unconventional tactics that resulted in you engaging 12 enemy fighters simultaneously, Colonel noted. That decision placed your crew, your aircraft, and your cargo at enormous risk. Yes, sir, but it also eliminated a significant threat to ongoing operations and saved the life of at least one friendly pilot. The tactical situation required immediate action, and no other friendly aircraft were available to respond. The debriefing continued for nearly 2 hours, with senior officers questioning every aspect of her engagement. Sarah described her maneuvering techniques, ammunition management, target prioritization, and damage assessment procedures. She explained how transport aircraft characteristics could be exploited for aerial combat under specific circumstances. Several officers remained openly skeptical about her claims until maintenance reports arrived documenting extensive battle damage to her aircraft. Cannon holes, missile fragments, and hydraulic leaks provided physical evidence that supported her account of the engagement. Captain, General said finally, your actions today represent either extraordinary heroism or dangerous insubordination, depending on perspective. The tactical results speak for themselves, but the operational implications are significant. Sir, I understand that my actions exceeded normal transport pilot authority, but the circumstances were exceptional, and I believed immediate action was necessary to prevent greater losses. Admiral Richardson leaned forward with obvious interest. Captain, you mentioned studying fighter tactics during off-duty hours. How extensive was this self-directed training? Sir, I've studied aerial combat for approximately 6 years, focusing on weapon systems, maneuvering techniques, and tactical doctrine. I maintained current knowledge of fighter aircraft capabilities and enemy tactical methods. 6 years, the Admiral repeated slowly. That's more extensive study than some fighter pilots receive. Why did you pursue this training when it wasn't required for transport operations? Sarah hesitated before answering honestly. Sir, I applied for fighter pilot training 3 times and was rejected each time. I continued studying aerial combat because I believed transport pilots should understand all aspects of military aviation. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Sarah had been fighter pilot training, but had acquired combat knowledge through independent study. Her aerial victories proved that artificial distinctions between aircrew roles might not reflect actual capabilities. General closed his folder and looked directly at Sarah. Captain, I'm going to be frank with you. Your actions today have created significant complications for military leadership. Transport pilots aren't supposed to engage in aerial combat, regardless of circumstances or outcomes. But sir, Sarah replied carefully, transport pilots often operate in combat zones where threats can't be avoided. Shouldn't we be trained to defend ourselves and our missions effectively? That's exactly the question your performance has raised, Colonel admitted. If transport crews can achieve tactical results like yours, perhaps our training programs need fundamental revision. The discussion that followed revealed deep philosophical divisions among senior officers about aircrew roles and training requirements. Some argued that Sarah's success proved transport pilots needed expanded combat training. Others insisted that specialized roles existed for sound operational reasons. Captain, Admiral Richardson said finally, I'm recommending you for immediate transfer to the Naval War College for detailed analysis of your tactical methods. We need to understand whether your techniques can be taught to other transport crews. General nodded agreement. I'm also initiating a comprehensive review of transport aircraft defensive capabilities and crew training programs. Your performance suggests we've been underutilizing significant tactical assets. The formal debriefing concluded with instructions for Sarah to prepare detailed written reports describing her combat techniques and tactical decision-making processes. These documents would form the basis for potential changes in training doctrine and operational procedures. As the senior officers filed out of the room, Colonel remained behind to speak privately with Sarah. His expression showed a mixture of pride and concern about the attention her actions had attracted. Sarah, I need you to understand something important, he said quietly. What you accomplish today will either make your career or destroy it completely. There's no middle ground when you challenge fundamental assumptions about military operations. Sir, I wasn't trying to challenge anything. I was just trying to save lives and complete my mission. I believe that, but intent doesn't always matter in military politics. Some people will see your success as proof that current training programs are inadequate. Others will view it as dangerous deviation from established doctrine. Colonel walked to his window overlooking the flight line where maintenance crews continued working on Sarah's battle-damaged aircraft. You've opened a debate that's been brewing for years about whether artificial distinctions between aircrew roles serve any useful purpose. What do you think, sir? Honestly, I think you've proven that exceptional individuals can succeed regardless of artificial limitations. But I also think you've created enemies among people who benefit from maintaining current systems. The conversation was interrupted by urgent communications from headquarters requesting immediate video conference with senior Pentagon officials. News of Sarah's aerial victories had reached the highest levels of military leadership, triggering emergency reviews of training doctrine and operational policies. Captain, you're about to become the center of national attention, Colonel warned. Military publications, defense contractors, and congressional committees will all want to understand how you achieved these results. Sarah felt overwhelming fatigue as the adrenaline from combat and debriefing finally wore off. She had awakened that morning as an anonymous transport pilot flying routine cargo missions. Now she found herself at the center of debates about fundamental military doctrine and training programs. Sir, I just want to return to flying missions and serving my country effectively. I'm afraid that's not going to be possible, at least not immediately. Your techniques need to be analyzed, documented, and potentially incorporated into training programs. That process will take months or possibly years. The implications were sobering. Sarah had proven her point about transport pilot capabilities, but success had come at the cost of her preferred anonymity and routine flying assignments. She would become a test case for new approaches to military aviation training. There's one more thing you need to know, Colonel added. Intelligence reports indicate that enemy forces have placed a substantial bounty on your capture or elimination. Your aerial victories have made you a high-priority target. Sarah absorbed this information with the same calm determination she had shown during aerial combat. Threats were part of military service, and she had already proven her ability to handle unexpected challenges. Sir, does this mean I'm grounded indefinitely? Not grounded, but your future assignments will be carefully planned to maximize your value while minimizing risks. You've become too valuable an asset to lose to routine combat operations. The conversation concluded with instructions for Sarah to report to the War College within 72 hours for extensive debriefing and analysis sessions. Her combat techniques would be studied by tactical experts, simulation specialists, and training development personnel. As Sarah left the command building, she encountered waiting nervously near the entrance. Her co-pilot's expression showed a mixture of pride and concern about their shared experience. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for today," he said quietly. "I learned more about flying in 4 hours than in 6 months of routine missions. What we did today was necessary but dangerous. Don't expect every mission to involve aerial combat." "Ma'am, I know that, but I also know that transport pilots are capable of much more than anyone imagined. You proved that today." Sarah walked toward her quarters while considering the day's events and their long-term implications. She had achieved a tactical victory that saved lives and eliminated enemy threats, but success had fundamentally changed her career trajectory and personal life. The base was buzzing with excitement as news of her aerial victories spread among personnel. Maintenance crews gathered around her damaged aircraft, examining battle damage and discussing the engagement with obvious pride. Fighter pilots approached respectfully, seeking details about her combat techniques. But Sarah also noticed some individuals maintaining careful distance, their expressions showing uncertainty about transport pilots engaging in aerial combat. Change was never universally welcomed, especially when it challenged established hierarchies and traditional roles. As evening approached, Sarah realized that her life had been permanently altered by 24 minutes of aerial combat. She had proven that artificial distinctions between aircrew roles were largely meaningless when faced with determined opposition and innovative tactics. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as military leadership struggled to understand the implications of her success. Training programs would need revision, operational doctrine required updating, and personnel policies demanded reconsideration. But tonight, Sarah felt deep satisfaction knowing that 12 wounded soldiers were receiving medical care because she had chosen to act when action was required. The lives saved justified every risk taken and every rule bent during those crucial minutes above the mountains. Her phone buzzed with messages from family, friends, and colleagues who had heard preliminary reports about her aerial engagement. The story was spreading beyond military circles, attracting attention from media organizations and defense industry analysts. 6 months after her legendary aerial engagement, Captain Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College delivering her final presentation on transport aircraft combat effectiveness. The audience included senior officers from all military branches, defense contractors, foreign military, and congressional committee members. Her research had fundamentally changed how military leadership viewed transport aircraft capabilities and crew training requirements. The Combat Maneuver Manual had become required reading at flight training schools worldwide, and her tactical innovations were being incorporated into operational doctrine across multiple air forces. The fundamental assumption that transport pilots lack combat capabilities proved demonstrably false when properly trained personnel operated within appropriate tactical parameters, Sarah explained to the attentive audience. Artificial distinctions between aircrew roles often reflect bureaucratic convenience rather than operational reality. The presentation included detailed analysis of her aerial engagement, breaking down each tactical decision and maneuvering technique for educational purposes. Computer simulations demonstrated how transport aircraft characteristics could be exploited for combat effectiveness under specific circumstances. General, now serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, asked the first question during the discussion period. Captain, your techniques have been tested extensively in simulator environments. Do you believe average transport pilots can achieve similar results with appropriate training? Sir, simulation results suggest that properly trained transport crews can achieve significant combat effectiveness against conventional fighter tactics. The key factors are systems knowledge, tactical awareness, and adaptive thinking rather than inherent pilot characteristics. Admiral Richardson, recently appointed as Secretary of the Navy, followed up with operational concerns. Captain, implementing your training recommendations would require substantial resource allocation and program restructuring. Can you quantify the potential tactical benefits? Sarah consulted her prepared statistics. Sir, analysis indicates that combat-trained transport crews could reduce fighter escort requirements by approximately 30% while maintaining equivalent mission success rates. The cost savings and tactical flexibility would be substantial. The presentation continued for nearly 3 hours, with Sarah addressing questions about training methodologies, aircraft modifications, tactical limitations, and implementation timelines. Her research had been exhaustive, examining every aspect of transport aircraft combat employment. During a break between sessions, Colonel approached with obvious pride and satisfaction. Sarah, you've exceeded every expectation anyone had for this research project. Your work will influence military aviation for decades. Sir, I hope it leads to better training and more effective operations. Transport pilots deserve the opportunity to develop their full potential. You've certainly proven that point conclusively. I have some news you'll find interesting. The Secretary of Defense has approved establishment of a new training program based entirely on your research. Sarah felt excitement and apprehension in equal measure. Creating new training programs was gratifying, but she had hoped to return to operational flying duties after completing her research assignment. Sir, what role would I play in this new program? You'd be the commanding officer of the 1st Combat Transport Training Squadron. The program would train selected transport crews in advanced combat techniques using modified aircraft specifically equipped for multi-role operations. The offer was everything Sarah had dreamed of during her years of frustrated fighter pilot applications. She would finally have the opportunity to train pilots in combat techniques while proving that artificial role distinctions served no useful purpose. Sir, I'm honored by the opportunity. When would the program begin operations? Immediately. You'll have 6 months to establish curriculum, select initial instructor personnel, and prepare facilities. The first class of student pilots reports for training in January. The remainder of the conference focused on implementation details for Sarah's training recommendations. Military leadership had enthusiastically embraced her research conclusions, recognizing that transport aircraft represented underutilized tactical assets with significant combat potential. That evening, Sarah attended a formal dinner honoring her research contributions and upcoming command assignment. The guest list included senior military leaders, defense industry executives, and international military representatives studying her tactical innovations. Recently promoted to major and assigned as her executive officer, approached during the reception. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've taught me about flying and leadership. You earned your promotion through excellent performance and dedication. You'll make an outstanding instructor in the new program." "Ma'am, I'm still amazed by how much everything has changed since that morning 6 months ago. One engagement revolutionized an entire military specialty." Sarah reflected on the transformation her aerial victory had triggered. Transport pilot training now included combat maneuvering, weapons employment, and tactical decision-making. Aircraft procurement specifications required enhanced defensive systems and multi-role capabilities. The real change was proving that pilots are pilots, regardless of aircraft assignment, Sarah observed. Combat effectiveness depends on training, determination, and tactical knowledge rather than artificial role categories. The dinner speaker was General, who used the occasion to announce additional military aviation reforms inspired by Sarah's research. Fighter pilot training would now include transport aircraft familiarization, while transport crews would receive enhanced combat instruction. Captain has demonstrated that excellence in one aviation specialty translates directly to others when supported by appropriate training and opportunity, the General explained. We're eliminating artificial barriers that prevented optimal utilization of pilot capabilities. After dinner, Sarah found herself surrounded by foreign military seeking information about implementing similar programs in their air forces. Her tactical innovations had attracted international attention, with several countries requesting technical cooperation agreements. "Captain," the British Air said formally, "the Royal Air Force would be honored to exchange personnel with your new training squadron. Our transport crews would benefit enormously from your instructional expertise." Similar requests came from Australian, Canadian, German, and Israeli representatives. Sarah's research had implications extending far beyond American military aviation, potentially influencing training doctrine worldwide. The social obligations concluded near midnight, leaving Sarah alone to contemplate the extraordinary changes that had resulted from her split-second decision to engage enemy fighters 6 months earlier. That brief aerial combat had transformed her from an anonymous transport pilot into an international authority on military aviation training. Her phone rang with a call from her parents, who had followed news coverage of her research and upcoming command assignment with obvious pride and concern. "Sarah, we're so proud of what you've accomplished," her mother said warmly. "But we're also worried about the dangerous attention your success has attracted." Intelligence reports confirmed that enemy organizations continued seeking opportunities to eliminate or capture her. Several terrorist groups had offered substantial rewards for successful attacks against the pilot who had humiliated their air force. "Mom, security precautions are comprehensive, and I'll be working primarily in training environments rather than combat zones. The risks are manageable." "We know you can handle whatever challenges arise," her father added. "You've already proven that repeatedly. Just remember that you have family who need you to come home safely." The conversation reminded Sarah that her success had implications beyond military aviation. Her example had inspired countless young women to pursue aviation, careers previously considered impossible. Flight schools reported dramatic increases in female applicants seeking both military and civilian pilot training. After ending the call, Sarah reviewed briefing materials for her new command assignment. The Combat Transport Training Squadron would operate advanced aircraft specifically modified for multi-role missions. Students would learn combat maneuvering, weapons employment, electronic warfare, and tactical coordination. The program represented everything she had hoped to achieve when applying for fighter pilot training years earlier. Instead of flying single-role fighters, she would command a squadron teaching pilots to excel in multiple aviation specialties simultaneously. Her research had proven that artificial distinctions between aircrew roles reflected bureaucratic convenience rather than operational necessity. Skilled pilots could master multiple aircraft types and mission profiles when provided appropriate training and opportunities. The new training program would produce graduates capable of flying transport, combat, reconnaissance, and electronic warfare missions with equal proficiency. These multi-role pilots would provide unprecedented operational flexibility while reducing overall personnel requirements. Sarah spent the early morning hours reviewing personnel files for potential instructor assignments. The program would attract exceptional pilots from all aviation specialties, creating a cadre of experts in unconventional tactical employment. Several former fighter pilots had requested transfer to her squadron, recognizing that transport aircraft offered unique tactical opportunities. Their experience would complement her own background, creating comprehensive instructional capabilities. As dawn broke over the War College campus, Sarah prepared for her final meeting with senior leadership before departing for her new command assignment. The discussion would cover program objectives, resource requirements, and long-term expansion plans. 6 months of intensive research had confirmed her belief that pilot capabilities were largely independent of aircraft assignments. Exceptional individuals could excel in any aviation specialty when supported by appropriate training and leadership. Her aerial victory had been possible because she refused to accept artificial limitations on her capabilities. The new training program would ensure that future pilots received opportunities to develop their full potential regardless of initial aircraft assignments. The meeting with senior leadership lasted most of the morning, finalizing details for program implementation and long-term objectives. Sarah received authorization to recruit instructor personnel from all military branches and allied air forces. Captain General concluded, "This program represents the most significant innovation in military aviation training since the establishment of separate air forces. Your research has fundamentally changed how we view pilot capabilities and training requirements. Sir, I'm honored to lead this program and grateful for the opportunity to prove that artificial limitations serve no useful purpose when excellence is the objective." As Sarah prepared to leave the War College for her new command, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from frustrated transport pilot to internationally recognized authority on military aviation training. Her aerial engagement had lasted only 24 minutes, but its implications would influence pilot training for generations. The Combat Transport Training Squadron would graduate pilots capable of excelling in any aviation assignment, proving conclusively that artificial role distinctions reflected bureaucratic inertia rather than operational reality. Sarah had finally achieved her goal of eliminating barriers that prevented optimal utilization of pilot capabilities. The transport pilot who had been told she wasn't fighter material would now command a squadron, proving that exceptional pilots could master any aircraft and mission profile when provided appropriate training and opportunities. Her legacy would be measured not in aerial victories, but in the careers and capabilities of pilots who would benefit from training programs she had created. That afternoon, Sarah drove toward her new command assignment with deep satisfaction and anticipation. The girl who had dreamed of becoming a fighter pilot had achieved something far more significant. She had revolutionized military aviation training and opened opportunities for countless future pilots to achieve their full potential. The war had ended 2 months earlier, partly due to air superiority achieved by better trained and more capable aircrew. Sarah's tactical innovations had been rapidly disseminated throughout military aviation, contributing to decisive victories that brought conflicts to successful conclusions. Her aircraft still bore scars from that legendary engagement 6 months earlier, now preserved as a testament to what transport pilots could achieve when circumstances demanded excellence. The bullet holes and battle damage served as permanent reminders that artificial limitations existed primarily in the minds of people who lacked imagination and determination. Captain Sarah had proven that transport pilots could think differently than everyone expected, and that difference had changed military aviation forever. Sarah turned off her phone and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges as demanding as today's aerial combat, but requiring different types of courage and determination in programs and operational doctrine. Change was never easy, especially when it challenged decades of conventional wisdoming odds. "Watch me," she said quietly, banking toward the approaching enemy formation with the calm determination of someone who had finally found their true calling.